Good evening, City of Canby. Welcome to our Monday, September 25th regular Planning Commission meeting. Please join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Okay. First up is consent items. We have draft meeting minutes from the May 8th, 2023 session, and I believe we have enough attendees to go ahead and entertain a motion to approve or reject those meeting minutes.
I move to approve the minutes as written for the May 8th, 2023 meeting.
Do we have a second?
I second.
Very well. Let's do a roll call vote, starting with Commissioner Driscoll on the end.
I wasn't here for it.
So abstain?
I'll abstain. I wasn't involved.
Aye.
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 I abstain.
4-0 approved as written. Very well. Next item up is citizen input on non-agenda items. This is an opportunity for members of the public to address the Planning Commission on non-agenda items. Each person will be given 3 minutes to speak. Staff and Planning Commission will make every effort to respond to the questions raised during citizens input before the meeting ends or as quickly as possible thereafter. You may speak on non-agenda items via Zoom. To use the Zoom, please send an email to the following link, publiccomments@canbyoregon.gov, no later than 3 p.m. today, which is a long time ago, and provide your name and topic you would like to speak on. Do we have any non-agenda items from citizen input? We have none. Moving on to new business. There is none. Moving on to the public hearing. There is none. At this point, we will move to the Planning Commission work session. The purpose of tonight's work session is to give the Planning Commission the opportunity to continue the administrative variance discussion from our September 11th meeting. To make the most of the short time we are given for these work sessions, public comment will not be taken. Instead, we invite public comment at all of the Planning Commission's regular meetings under either of the two opportunities dedicated on each agenda for public comment. In addition, we invite the public to contact city staff with comments or concerns. Although this is a public meeting, the Planning Commission cannot make any formal decision in a work session. Next step actions are often determined for deliberation and discussion at a properly noticed Planning Commission hearing. With that, Planning Director Hardy will present on continued administrative variance discussion. Take it away, Don.
Good evening, Chair Ellison and Commissioners. This is a continuation of our discussion previously, and I wanted to start out with some high-level comments as we start to dive into this tonight. As we start to dive into this, it becomes apparent there's like layers to this, and so really tonight I would like, again, your attention to the standards that we're looking at that might be adjusted. And so we're going to look at the current standards that the city has for minor variances. We'll look at 10% adjustments and 20% adjustments. The idea at the end of the day is we'll have more work sessions regarding this. It would go through the hearings process, the Planning Commission and City Council. I'm believing that we will have a list of eligible variance, minor variance items at the end of the day. I think that's my vision of this, and that may not include everything. So I'm giving you the full boat tonight about what could be adjusted, but it may very well be that, like, for example, height issues, that may very well be not one of the eligible criteria for that. We could choose to pick and choose what those are. So I do believe that there's a need to have some flexibility for circumstances that do arise. Not every piece of property is configured the same way. I think it does fulfill the public good to have the ability to have small adjustments in the process, because there could be some very good projects that we want to give those to. So it's not always a project that's in need of help, for example, that may not be something we support, but rather it's across the entire spectrum of projects that we would end up looking at. So with that, Lainey, can you move to the next slide, please? So just, we're going to go back to the current standards again and identify applicable zones. And these are, again, we've selected these because I could have gone the full mill deal and done every zone in the city, and it's way too much. So we're biting this off with residential and the commercial residential zones. So R1, R15, R2, and CR. We're going to focus on those tonight because I just felt like initially, oh yeah, we can do them all, but like I think when we get into more commercial designations and they are different and employment's different, those are really special discussions. They're different. And the focus really, again, is on housing, really is the main item that I'm trying to focus on now, although longer term, I'd like the whole process to include other zones besides the ones we're talking about tonight. So we'll talk about the deviations, possible criteria, which are pretty open and pretty broad. I started with a template of what we have already and just decided to, use those as possible placeholders for continuation with those criteria, but we can completely add those, and there'll be a section here for you to provide your comment. And then the process itself, which would be, should 10% adjustments be a type 1 process and 20% be a type 2, and everything beyond 20% be a type 3 public hearing process? That's at the end of this discussion. And then next steps, I'll go through those as well. Next slide, please, Lainey. So again, back to the current code, really the administrative variance process only applies to setbacks and sign sizes. Quite restrictive, probably the most restrictive I've seen actually in a jurisdiction where it's that narrow of a focus. Next slide, Lainey. And then everything else besides those setbacks and sign variances for 10%. If you're at 11%, you're going to be in a type 3 public hearing process at 11%. So that's the reason to have some discussion around this. Again, the zones that we're going to cover tonight are identified there. Next slide, please, Lainey. This is a lot of information here, and I'm going to go through this. And again, there's a lot to cover here, but I think I want to start out with these are R1, R15, and R2. The recognition is that the setbacks are universal across those zones. And that's another topic for possible discussion as well. But you'll see that they're all essentially the same. And they are different, though. So single-family residential R1, medium density R15 are different, I think, intensities for sure. And so the treatment of those are, the lot sizes are larger. R2 is apartment, really multifamily zoning or townhouse zoning. So like looking at this and just, again, maybe we'll go through the whole presentation, we can come back to this, but you can see just starting with the front yard setback, what a 10% deviation would do would be instead of 20 feet, you're at 18 feet. And then at 20%, you're at 16 feet. And then side yards are essentially, this is about whole numbers here. So 10% doesn't get you anything. It doesn't get you a whole number. So you don't get anything. You're still at 7. You have to have a 20% deviation to get to 6 feet. We could calibrate this differently, but I think whole numbers are a way to go where if it's a whole number, you get the credit for that. But if you don't have a whole number, you're not getting the credit. So then we have the rear setbacks, which are slightly unusual. They're slightly different in the sense that one-story buildings are 15 feet, two-story buildings are 20 feet. And you can see that, again, with a one-story building, you could get to 14 feet. With a 10%, you could get to 12 feet with a 20% deviation. And part of this discussion as well is we can stop at 10% as well. This is just another way of discussing what should that be in those parameters. Two-story buildings, again, 20 feet is standard. It would be 18 feet for a two-story building, and then 20% would be 16 feet. We intentionally did not cover three-story buildings because they're the same setback as a two-story building. that may be one of those items for discussion as well, about the list of things that would stay and not. And, and again, that's up to the planning commission to make a recommendation that where does this become applicable? Do we stop it at 2 stories, or is it still applicable at 3 stories? So that's another one of those items that I want to have your attention to. Corner lots are a little unusual as well. They have their own standard. And so again, primary street yard is 20 feet. That's your front of your house. 18 feet with a 10% variation. 16 feet with a 20% variation. Secondary, that's a secondary yard that's not where your driveway is going to be 15 feet. It would be 14 feet at 10%, 12 feet at 20% deviation. And then the side yards, again, you can't get anything for 10% deviation because it's not a whole number. You'd have to go to 20% for side yard deviation. Rear yard, again, similar, but they're slightly different scenarios. So you have a 1-story building is 10 feet. You could get to 9 feet at 10% and 8 feet at 20%. 2-story, 15 feet. And then there's the standard 14 feet is the deviation at 10% and 12 feet at 20%. It's a lot of information there, so let me continue, and then we can come back to this. So next slide, please, Laney. So this impervious surface these are R1. We're kind of drilling these down, again, in terms of like what the main issues are. So impervious surface issues, if there were a granting of a administrative variance, that'd be a 10%, would be going from 60% maximum impervious to 66%. And then 72% at a 20% deviation. One side note on this, just maybe anticipating the question about what the standard should be on these based on engineering practices in terms of what number should be the number. We're doing coordination right now with Clackamas County, who does our building permit review processes. They also do the review for storm drainage. So there'll be a collaborative discussion between planning, our public works department, and the county on that item in specific. So kind of want to sidebar that discussion for tonight because I don't know what the answer is, but part of this is we're trying to get to the point of understanding what the engineering standard should be and what would be acceptable if we can quantify it. And also what the input of the, this body and the council also thinks is appropriate as well.
We do currently allow for materials that are pervious to be used, correct? It doesn't have to just be land. It can be materials that would
You
allow
can do,
filtration
like you could do pavers that are like pervious pavers. Yeah, absolutely. So there's some dynamics, and Canby is very fortunate that, you've got ag soils basically that are what we're on top of right now, as well as what's being developed in the area. So they infiltrate extremely well. I don't think folks in Canby understand and appreciate that, how much that is different than the rest of the metro area. It is significantly different as you go north and much more challenging to develop. You see a lot of storm ponds. You see a lot of different things that you don't see here. You see very few storm ponds. Most of it's infiltrated, and that is the process. But it's this dynamic between the county and the city on storm drainage. I'm trying to, so to speak, land the plane on this thing because it's there is a review, and I think part of that, there's a conversation that permeates, but it's an important conversation about, for example, hypothetically, I'm not suggesting this, but if the city had zero standard for what the maximum impervious surface is, what would the limitation be by the county? That's the question of the day. So that and what would that be based on? So I don't know what the answer to that is, but that's what we're seeking. And again, not supposing or forecasting or suggesting that we go that direction, but I think it's an important thing that we need to understand in the process. Then we have minimum lot sizes jumping on the R1, again, the single family residential. And so this is kind of, unfortunately, to Andy, Commissioner Eward's not here tonight, but this is, again, kind of what he was suggesting. I mean, this is where it all comes back. I'm walking down, and you're seeing all these lots that could theoretically infill. Well, that is exactly the situation. 7,000 square foot lot. It's slightly under let's say it's, 10% would get you to 6,300. So you might see a few more houses being built on infill with the 10% deviation to minimum lot size. And again, that's fairly close to 7,000. At 20%, it starts to deviate quite a bit more. It's 5,600 square feet. Again, what's the tolerance level? And, should we, again, stop it at 10% and that's it, and there's no 20% deviation? Other jurisdictions all across the board, almost all of them, I would say, well, the examples we looked at, they all had a 10% deviation. Not all of them had a 20% deviation. The question becomes, at what point do you require somebody to go into a full variance process? And you all know how difficult that is. And that bar is really high. And I know this commission has also really struggled with those decisions as well because the criteria is so specific. So just keeping that all in mind. And then lot frontage is another item, which is, again, in R1 at 60 feet for the minimum. 54 feet would be deviation at 10%, and 48 feet would be at 20%. And height, again, like I said, that may not be one of the items that we want to even tackle, but 35 feet is the maximum. You could get to 38 feet at 10% deviation. You could get to 42 feet at 20% deviation.
To clarify the definition of frontage, that's the distance from the front of the house to the road and not a width.
It would be the width essentially of the lot itself. So the frontage is the road surface area along the front of the house. So
Gotcha.
it'd be, yeah.
Thank you.
Next slide, please, Lenny.
Just a second, I need to start the recorder on the Zoom, just in case.
Okay.
Recording in progress.
Okay. Next slide, please, Lenny. So there was R15, I think, Laney, before that. Am I? Yeah, right there. So next one is medium density residential. Again, starting with the impervious surface. Now, when you get to R15 and R2, you have 70% impervious surface maximum. So it is more to begin with. This is the baseline. And you can see the deviation. We get you to 77% at 10% deviation and 84% at 20%. Then the minimum lot area, again, is 5,000 square feet. Could get to 4,500 with a 10% deviation. Again, that's not a huge swing at 500. It's more of a swing going to 20%. You're at 1,000 square feet difference from the standard at 20%. And the lot frontage, again, is 40 feet standard, 36 feet with a 10% deviation, 32 feet with a 20% deviation. And then townhouse lot frontage, and again, this could be or could not be something that we even want to include, but just wanted to throw that in there, which is 20 feet minimum for standard, 18 feet is a deviation, and 20 at 10%, 18 feet, and then at 20% is 16 feet. I think part of what we need to vet on this as well is fire access issues, which is just recognizing that's another element here that we've not layered that yet, but that will permeate this discussion as well. And then the height issue, 35 feet, again, is the standard, 38 feet at 10% and 42 feet at 20% deviation.
What are the density allowances for R15?
R15, you could essentially, you got 5,000 square feet, so you're looking at about 8 lots per acre.
And that's within the parameters?
Yeah.
Is it maxed out at 8 per acre, or does it allow for an unlimited amount or a higher?
It's maxed out because I'm just doing the math here. 8 times 5 is 40,000, so that's 43,560 as an acre. So I believe it's 8, so you can't get any more than that. I mean, yeah.
Because I was just wondering if we're bringing down the lot frontage for townhouses specifically, if that would allow more to fit on, which, I mean, I'm sure that it would to some extent, but, how far could that be taken in terms terms of density.
Really good observation, and I think some of this, as we get into the comp plan discussions further, we may very well find that, like, for areas that, where we're trying to create affordable housing, more affordable housing scenarios, that there may need to be new zones added to the city, and the R15 may not really be a zone that really fully yields that, and I believe there probably is some room between R15 and R2 with a zone between those two that actually may promote that better. We've had some use of the townhomes, but not a lot. There's been some that have been developed with that with the density that, but just because your townhome doesn't give you more units, So, but it is another tool, and I think townhomes are something that clearly needs to be discussed further about those, being in situations where they're available for people that be fee-owned primarily, as my townhome definition by itself would be a fee-owned product, I believe, versus an apartment project. It'd be something in a subdivision, but it would be attached. But to answer your question, they would not be able, just because their townhomes exceed the density. Okay.
Thank you.
Next slide, please. Then on R2, again, maximum impervious, this is high-density residential, maximum impervious is 70%, deviation of 10% would be 77%, and 20% deviation would be 84%. Lot frontage, again, is 20 feet as a standard, with a 10% deviation would be 18, and at 20% would be 16. And then height, again, 35 feet is standard, 38 feet with 10%, and 42 feet with 20% deviation. So next slide, please, Laney. So this is the CR zone, and again, you're going to start to see why they're not quite lining up, but because it's, has residential in its name, we stopped there and didn't go further into the commercial zones. Commercial zones are interesting because they do differ quite a bit from the residential zone. So we've got standard setbacks again here that at 20 feet, and then 18 feet would be 10% deviation, and at 20% would be 16 feet. Side yards, there is no, commercial to commercial is 0 feet, but if there is a residential to a commercial, it's 10 feet. That's the asterisk there. And then the deviation in that circumstance where there's residential against commercial would be 9 feet at a 10% deviation, and 8 feet at 20%. And then maximum impervious, maximum lot coverage is 60%, lot coverage 66% at 10%, and 20% deviation is 72%. So there is a slight nuance to this. Lot coverage is about buildings, whereas residential is about surface. So they're different entities in that sense, so this would not be about the impervious surface total, it would be about the building itself. So lot coverage is different than impervious surface area. So just to know that's kind of a weird nuance, but residential zones have the maximum amount allowed total roof, driveway, areas that where water does not percolate, and commercial has a set which is, and industrial, which has a set where it's the building footprint. So again, that's just a small piece of, not to dive into the weeds, but just to sort that for you. Lot size is 7,000 square feet, 10% deviation will be 6,300 square feet, 20% deviation would be 5,600 square feet. And then lot frontage, 60 foot is standard, 54 at 10% deviation, and 48 with a 20%. And then height, 45 feet is a standard maximum, and then it could go to 49 at 10% and 54 at 20%. Next slide, Laney.
May I ask, at the 45, 49, and 54 levels, how many stories could fit? Because I know some people can get 3 with 35, so is that 4, 5, and 6?
It depends on the height of the ceiling. And this gets tricky because commercial typically might have taller ceilings with them. And so I would say that if you did 10-foot ceilings, you'd almost have at 49 feet, you'd almost have 5 stories. Mm-hmm. And So 45, Laney, can we go back to that slide momentarily? So 49, 54. And 10, I mean, at 54, I think you're probably looking at 5 stories.
So it really just depends on the design, but we'd be looking at anywhere between 4 and 5.
I think the challenge on commercial is where is the parking going to go? I mean, that really is the issue. So in order to achieve that, it either have to be downtown with no parking requirements like the Dahlia. It would not be on 99. There's no way you could build a 4-story or 5-story building on 99 and have adequate parking unless you went underground, which would be extremely expensive. So I think there's some built-in realities to those, and perhaps in light of that, maybe the height is not such a big deal here, and so maybe that's one of those sidebar items that may not really be needed to adjust.
So parking is only not required in the downtown commercial area, but there's other CR zoning that would be subject to different parking requirements. Do you know what they are off the top of your head?
It would depend on the use, and I think part of that would be if it's, sometimes that could be a mix of uses that would happen there, so it'd have to follow the code. I don't have the detail here, but yeah, we would not be proposing deviation from those standards.
Okay.
Next slide, Laney. So this is on parking, speaking of parking. So then we get into parking, which is where should we deviate and give a 10% administrative variance? So bear with me on this heavy text here. So cutting to the chase here, you'd have to have 6 spaces to be able to, if we're going to use partial numbers here to get to a 10% administrative variance, you need at least 6 spaces to be 0.6 to be eligible to have a reduction. Otherwise, we're looking at 10 spaces minimum, where you'd allow, 10% of that would be 1, or the other option would be 20%. If that was allowed, you'd have 2 spaces. So first, I guess the first question out of the box is, should there be parking adjustments allowed? And if so, and I see some shaking of heads, but yeah, if so, where should that land? We use whole numbers on the other standards, and it's a question that we wanted to throw out there. So that's another one for thought, food for thought here. And then the last question is, should there be smaller scale be used to address infill projects? So those are just, again, items that, are part of the consideration here. Next slide, Laney. So this is, again, weighing out the criteria for current code and what those are for a 10% administrative variance. Again, this only applies to signs and setbacks. And you're going to largely see this being reflective of continuing the language, but there has been some modification that we are proposing. Let's start with the 10% deviation. Number 1 is the same. I think that there does need to be some sort of consideration for uniqueness of the situation to be eligible. I think that's a fundamental, and you see that across other jurisdictions. And so the other part of this is on number 2, what we need to kind of sort through on number 2, that was left in there, that the elements here that we decide on number 2, landscaping is one of those items. The other parts of the code this kind of gets into the list here of what we would carve out as exceptions. So if we left it at, it will not violate landscaping requirements, period, that would be one standard. And then the other parts of this, or any other chapter of the code, we would have to make some decisions on the 10% deviation as to what those might be. Is it just landscaping that we would be concerned with? Maybe it will not violate landscaping and height requirements of the underlying zone. What are those? So that needs to be vetted. Number 3, it's materially detrimental to other properties within the same vicinity. I think that's a quantitative and qualitative discussion there, but that's another element that I think is in the current code that probably should remain. We feel strongly that 10% and 20% deviation should not increase the lot sizes. The whole idea is that this is giving the deviation to decrease lot sizes, not as an increase. And that would go against everything that DLCD is trying to accomplish on, and what we're trying to accomplish as well for affordable housing. And then number 5 is just other standards that would be part of this. The 20% is a little more robust, and as you can see, I think the one on is to preserve trees or significant natural resources is added in. And I think that's the primary one that's different between the 20% and 10%.
Is there a reason you included the trees in 20 and not 10?
I think it's, part of this is, it just felt like that, the deviation is not great at 10%, and I feel like 20% is a more significant deviation. We don't really have a tree ordinance. This is the tricky part of this whole thing, and this is where we start to have that discussion about it could be in the 10%, and I would be okay with that. I guess part of this is I'm just trying to differentiate. It should be a higher bar for 20% than 10. I just feel like that by itself. It also depends on what the list is. If the list is like lot size and, setbacks, I'm not really sure if that standard should be super high for 10%. Based on the prior tables I showed. We're talking about a foot or two maybe. That's my perspective. But if it's other items that may be more objectionable, that would be another reason for that discussion. So I'm looking for, what your thoughts are on, I guess part of this is just trying to measure out where the comfort zone might be for deviations, because they will come up, and whether you want to see them as a type 3 application or as an administrative review application as part of this discussion. And I think that's, so what we're really trying to do, Commissioner Driscoll, is to weigh out the significance, I guess, of the impact. It's not that trees are not important, but it just felt like having the same standards that we have now, to be honest, I feel like they're high. I think the current standards, one, they don't even allow anything but setback, and so I guess to the extent we do have setbacks already built into the current code, and then for signs is the other one. So it's just more of, again, there may or may not, maybe to your question, there may or may not be any trees on the property at all, which would preclude you from using this measure.
Yeah, I was just curious.
Yeah, and maybe the wording of this will result in substantial preservation of trees on the property or something to that effect versus like, hey, is there a tree on the property? Well, no, there isn't, so then you can't use a 10% administrative variance. Or there's no, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd be curious what people's thoughts are. If we, instead of having a percentage deviation, had a set amount deviation, right? You can have 1 foot for, the setback, not the setback, but the side setback, or for X, Y, or Z, that it's like you can have up to this amount, and it puts you through this path of review, and then you can have up to a set amount instead of the percentage variations. If that would be any better or worse, and for what reasons? Would it be more straightforward, or would we be inviting people to get overly creative if we just straight up said you could potentially have an extra foot on this side or extra 2 feet on here?
There would be, and again, I like your thinking, and it doesn't necessarily need to be packaged into an administrative variance process. That was just kind of what came to mind, and the more you peel this back, the more complicated it gets. It sounds really simple on the front end of this thing, and then you start presenting it, and it's like, man, there's a lot of elements here. There are planning, I've seen other codes, and I think they would work equally well, where we have interpretations and exceptions. Those are sometimes called out in code, called interpretations and exceptions, or there's other things where there may be a director's review process involved, and we absolutely could limit those standards. We could come up with, we would still need criteria, but it would be different than, and that list would be probably rather short. I mean, and so, because if it was just up to 1 foot, and we'd have to have a list of what those standards are, but we could package this not as a variance, but as another process in the code.
And sounds like you might have interest in that as an option, potentially?
I think it would make sense to do that, and I mean, we could, if we come up with where's the comfort level, if it's a foot, instead of like trying to do all this math, then that, and I think what I'd like to do is like get to the point of like the main, is it the lot size? Is it the setbacks? Is it the, and we're still working on impervious surface. I'll come back and report back on that. That's still out there as the question, but I think impervious surface is another one. I think the lot frontage, again, that's not necessarily something I'm really like for or against necessarily, but I do think a lot of times we get setback issues. And that might get to the point of like, where the rounding thing is no longer necessary, but it's like you get up to this amount and you have to still have a set of criteria for that, but then it kind of lands that on where that's at. But we would need to know what those are, so that we had some parameters around what, we'd still have to build a box, so to speak, for like what those exceptions would be.
Well, I really appreciated that you're already engaging with fire on some of this, because what kind of comes to mind, again, the project on Grant that really motivated me to get involved here, they have a road 4 feet from their house, their bedroom window, 4 feet road. And that pretty much happened because when the lot was allowed to be split, they thought that the entrance was going to be more narrow. And then after the lot was allowed to be legally split, then somebody decided to confer with fire, and they said, oh, there's no way we can get back to anything if you keep it that narrow. So then they lost another like 6 feet or something. And so then it's right up onto somebody's house. And that's like really poor planning, right? We should have never let them split it if it was going to need to be that wide without somebody actively saying it's okay to get that close to somebody's house. So that's kind of what I'm thinking when I look at some of this is, if we say it's okay for any one place, any one lot, would it work if we say okay to all of the lots? Because at that point, all of the sequential lots are subject to these same new rules and exceptions and everything else. And are we going to be able to keep people safe if something bad happens? So when things get really dense, that's what I'm most concerned about, safety-wise. And then the cars and the trees, keeping the trees.
Well, and those are all good. And I think, part of this is, just the reality of, I don't want the standards to be adjustable and then we find out, well, that's great, but yet you've got to have some access point that is certain width that meets the fire code. That's contrary to the whole notion of how to do that, and it becomes pretty awkward. And it makes it more complicated since fires, they're baked into our process by codification in our code, but they're really a separate entity. So it's like just trying to make sure it's consistent. So I think that,
So Don, you couldn't just say, we're good with 10% variance, as long as the 10% variance doesn't in any way impede minimum standards for life safety or fire.
It could be that simple. And to be honest with you, I feel like there's a more rigorous process than I've seen in other places I work, where like, I mean, I'm not saying there shouldn't be a standard, but, yes, I think I'd like to get down to fire life safety if we could, or some other thing that would be parallel to that. I think, or we put maximums on it, this could be a hybrid of some sort, you can do a 10%, but the caveats of you can only do numerically so much of an adjustment, and maybe that, I don't want to get too heavy on the math, but what are the outer limits of this thing, I guess, is what I'm trying to get to. And, but yeah, fire life safety, I think, is really a critical element here.
Because it's tricky, right? In some areas, you'll have something that's already existing, and then they're like, oh, if we add this one project, then it's okay. But then as you keep adding projects, if fire is reviewing each one individually, they're saying this project in and of itself, in its little box compared to the current situation, is okay. And I don't even know how much they look at the current situation so much as just evaluate it in the box of this specific project. So it seems like it's a really tricky thing to be able to stay ahead of that, I guess, in making things more dense.
And I think part of this is, this is really intended to be for the parts of their code, largely that are current in our process, but just as okay, sounds good. As a caveat, the cottage developments, planned unit developments, and commercial, residential being allowed in commercial areas, those other efficiency measures, I'm visualizing those being standalone and this really not permeating that. We're going to have a whole set of other discussions around those and what the parameters are of those. But the rest of our code, which is fairly substantial, it just, whether we have some interpretation section that, and we still are going to need something, back to Chair Ellison's point about, is it just fire life safety, or are there other things that are important? And I see this conversation continuing as well on this. I would say what I'm hearing, though, is this is an administrative focus where, because interpretations would be administrative. They would be, I'm not even sure if they would be appealable or not. But that would be another question that, if it's a type 1, it would not be appealable. And maybe gets into the deviation at type, and I haven't quite got to the slide, whereas a 20%, I believe, is a type 2 at least, and would need to have notice. So it'd be a decision that could be appealed with notice.
It just seems like the 10% deviation is a pretty comfortable, you're talking real minimal, but if it comes down to, a decision over a foot or not, then okay, great. But the 20% is actually quite a bit different, particularly when it comes to the heights and the setbacks. And so for me,
I would say that the
20%
height
would be
at 10% is still really significant in most of these cases. And 10% reductions in parking make a really big difference too.
Well, I was looking at, 35 versus 38? Is the eye going to see that vice?
Is it next to a
35
17-foot
versus-
house or a 30-foot house?
Well, I'm saying 35 versus 44, to me, that would be a pretty noticeable difference, I would think. But I don't know, 10% to me sounds pretty reasonable for an administrative.
Especially sticking to whole numbers. That's
Yeah.
kind of pushes 10% into the prime position.
Yeah.
And others, because I could absolutely, we're coming back. This is a multi-review thing. We're at the beginning of this. So I absolutely, and I hear what you're saying on the 20%. We had to throw it out there. Some jurisdictions, it's interesting. There's not universality on this at all. It's you kind of wonder what the backstory is when you start looking at these other communities. Like, what conversations did they have? Because they are not like, hey, they just borrow from these guys. They didn't do that at all. It's very interesting to see what that is, and it's probably the history and the character of those communities that allowed it. But we are an outlier in the sense that we don't really have anything other than, one very narrow band here of. And the code, as much as, we like to think it's perfect, it isn't. In fact, it has a lot of challenges to it. And so part of that is just giving some latitude to have reasonableness, but also have predictability and also have compatibility. So those are all and I agree, as we get into the 20%, it does, start to permeate into other things that might have more impacts.
Well, and 20% with an access to an alleyway, I think that's where you really start to see the differences. And so that's where, to me, 20% is way too far out on some of on at least a handful of those items you had on the first, what was that first slide, on slide 7, I think it was. So
I think for me, the decision about how granular we get, how far into the weeds do we get, is I'm still trying to understand the scope of the problem. What's the problem we're trying to solve? We know we're maybe too strict, and I get that, and we should align with other cities that have this process. But when I think about what's come to us as a variance, I look back through, not all of them, but in my time, none of them we would have still seen all of them, even if this 10% was included. But I guess what we don't, so that's not a problem. We're not going to see less because we haven't. Again, I didn't look at all of them, but most of them. And so that, to me, doesn't seem like a problem we're trying to solve. So then maybe do we not know how many are walking away or turning, just saying, I can't deal with Canby, because you don't have this? Is that quantitative anywhere? Do we know what the scope of the problem is that we're trying to solve here?
And great question. I would not necessarily say we're turning people away, but are they, it's somewhat, I guess there's two answers to that. One is you look at other jurisdictions and there's elements of reasonableness in their codes. And I think part of this is an evolutionary process of what we probably will see over the next 10 years. Housing prices probably aren't going to go down. You probably are going to see an increase in people wanting to do an infill, and maybe they are 500 to 700 square feet short of putting another home on their property, or they want to put an accessory dwelling unit on their property. These are the things I think that will be forthcoming, and throwing somebody into a complete variance process, for a few feet doesn't feel like it's the right public interest thing. I mean, so. I would say that also there have been probably circumstances where people to some degree, it's like, okay, you got to follow the code. And they basically said, well, I'm not doing a public hearing variance. So you haven't seen those because they decided to not.
That's what I meant by walk away.
And I think it's more like the reasonableness. Would you get a better product with somebody doing 11 or 12% that knew they were going to have to do a public hearing versus under just following the code or, requesting a 10% setback request. So
is that like anecdotal, or do we have any idea when that happens?
Well, it happens a lot in our pre-app process and just, in terms of discussion. And we're not privy to the boardrooms that these people are discussing this after they meet with us. But I'm sure the conversation is like, there's no way I want to subject myself to a variance discretionary process on this. Time is money. I don't want to spend more time on a discretionary process that I may not be successful on, even though it's a small ask.
What, do we have any idea what percentage of the time that you get a pre-app for a development, not maybe a single house, but what percentage of the time do they not come back after a pre-app?
We probably could track some of that. I think the numbers are rather low on that. I think those, it's not that people are saying that's a death blow to the project, but I think it's more like, if even a 1% change is what I'm talking about, like if it's not a setback and a sign variance and you want some marginal change and it's like a percentage, that, would that materially make them do something different that might give them more ability to be more creative in the process?
Yeah, so that's me. I'm just trying to wrap my head around the scope of, it sounds like what we're trying to do is more anticipate the future and be kinder, friendlier, you know what I mean? But, for these future different types of developments than what we have now, would we, if we put something like this in, would we be able to measure the success of it? How do we know? Is it spinning the dials? Is it the work that we're doing here and now the city council will do? How do we know what's the quantitative measure of success? This is just me with my corporate hat on always, but how do we know if it's spinning the dials or not?
We have some ability to measure that and some ability probably to not measure that.
Okay.
I think that maybe my fundamental take on this is there's a reason that every other community our size has administrative variances in their process. If you ask them, could you live without them? They might say, yeah, but it would make our lives really challenging because that's just kind of baked into planning, to be honest with you. This is one of the few jurisdictions I've ever seen where it's so restrictive on giving any latitude whatsoever on what I would believe is a reasonable request by an applicant.
When I walked in today, my tendency was to throw a 5% blanket number variance regarding any issue. But the way that you've laid the information out here is that there are a lot of cases where 5% won't get you anything if you're sticking with round numbers. But then you've also said even 1% would be helpful. Is there value in 5%?
I think it would help to some degree. I mean, and, maybe, we could also tier this and say 5% really has no criteria. It's basically a give me. 10% has these criteria. That would be another way to do it. I mean, I think that would, and it's a little unique because I haven't seen that, but I think there's merit in that. Because, 5%, and then again, listing out what the exceptions are, maybe height is not one of them, that would be part of that. These are the 8 items that you can pick from that will give you some latitude, and 5% is pretty much automatic, type 1. 10% is maybe still a type 1, but it has criteria that are measurable that we look at.
Building on that, would there be a limitation on how many of the criteria could get variations? So if you've got a list of 8 things that you can get, up to 5% on as a give me and so much for 10%, can you do all 8? Are you limited to 3 of them? I mean, do we have some guardrails on it that way?
And I think part of that is it depends on kind of what we're trying to achieve, back to Commissioner Jarosh's comments about what's the purpose. There's many jurisdictions and they call them adjustments, and we don't call them adjustments here, but other jurisdictions call them adjustments. And sometimes there's many of those. It's infinite, to be honest with you. That doesn't need to be infinite. I mean, we can decide it's less than that, but if that works for that application, I think you're probably going to see in most circumstances that it's rare that you're going to have many of these in combination now together. I'm guessing you might have maybe 2 or 3 at the most. But having 10 of these, I just don't think we have that product type here where we have really dense, multifamily. That would probably be a case where I've seen that in other jurisdictions where adjustments are just, you need many of them to make it work. Laney, can you switch to the next slide, please? So this is the major variance, again, criteria, and again, I'm not trying to beat this in, but just trying to, exceptional and extraordinary circumstances. And this is where, if you're not doing a 10% setback exception, because our code only allows that, and you're doing 11% on your setbacks, you're going to be at this criteria. Or if you're doing anything that is, everything from, lot size at 1%, you're going to be doing this. So a lot size, for every code, you'd have to be going through this process to meet all these standards for a major variance. So that'd be, exceptional circumstances, maintain substantially the same property rights, doesn't it's not detrimental to the comprehensive plan, and not detrimental to properties in the vicinity, and minimum variance needed to alleviate the condition, and unique conditions of the property, which are somewhat parallel to the circumstances of the 10%, but in combination, these standards are quite high for a small deviation. Next slide, please, Laney. Which kind of leads us again, and it sounds like we're talking between the 5% and 10%, but this was kind of the idea, was that the tiered process here And maybe the type 2 goes away and we just end up with a type 1 and we have 5 and 10% deviation, and then we have a type 3. And essentially, if you're more than 10%, you're at a type 3. So.
I could live with that.
So I have some work to bring some stuff back. Commissioner Hutchinson, did you have something else you were? Okay. But I think this is, again, you'll see more of this. I'm not expecting like plurality or consensus, but just if there are thoughts you have on this, you'll have other chances to do it. But I can definitely work on that 5% piece and 10% criteria. And then also a list kind of what maybe the starting point of the, maybe on the 5%, the list is broader. Maybe the list is inclusive of more elements and the 10% is shorter as the elements,
I think height, parking, and maintaining existing trees are things that we would want to prioritize and not give much exception to. I'm concerned about losing all the big trees that we have.
We don't have a tree ordinance, so.
I know, but
So that's, we're out.
I would love to work on that. But, it is something that is technically in the code that you're not, if you're getting rid of so much vegetation that you need to replace it with something else. So not having the tree ordinance basically means you can take out a 100-year-old tree and put in an arborvitae and call it good.
Right, so what they do is they they find that impasse, they log their property, which they're allowed to do, then they come back with their request. So, yeah, they work around it. It's because we don't have an ordinance.
Yeah, well, and it's a problem. But I mean, it would be something that if we're talking about long-term planning with this, that would be something I wouldn't really want to be giving much on personally.
Our hands are tied.
So let me bring this back, closing this down, and there'll be more discussions around this. And that's really what I had tonight. Unless you have other comments or questions, I can dive into the planning director's update.
All right, let's go with the director update.
So on the planning director update, we will not be having a hearing or work session on October 9. We thought we were going to have a design review application. That will actually happen on the 23rd. There's 2 design review applications on October 23rd that will be coming to the Planning Commission. And then November 13th, we're going to have our housing needs analysis and possibly a subdivision application on the 13th of November. November 27th, we're going to continue our discussions on housing efficiency measures, and there may be a subdivision application as well that evening. December 11th, we don't have any agenda item at this point. I may bring back the discussion from tonight to that, and we'll have more information about impervious surface, and then I can give you some more, boy, I'll lay this down. My hope is that we can make this simple. And that's a theme, and I kind of felt you guys wanted it. This is it's a lot, I get it. But breaking it down into its simple form, and I think we can get there. And then a few other dates to keep in mind. We have a project advisory committee for the comprehensive plan on October 17 at 6 p.m. And the public's welcome. You folks are all welcome to that meeting. It's here in the Willamette Room. And November 1st, we'll have a city council work session at 6 p.m. on the comprehensive plan and urban growth boundary process. And then November 14th, I want a big plug for this. Thank you all for those that did attend the last open house summit. I really want to make a significant plug for November 14 for the second community open house for the comprehensive plan, starting at 6 p.m. at the police station. This will be a lot about kind of visioning, forward thinking, and then also a board game kind of with maps on where residential employment lands will happen. There'll be groups and breakout sessions. I felt the first one was fairly well attended. I'd like to get even more people involved with this in the community. So please, in your groups, in your circles, please let people know in your circles and their circles. That would be great. And that's coming up, and that kind of wraps us up for the year, and then we'll be going into more planning stuff next year. Both development review and also long-range items will be coming forth as well.
And we have a new liaison from council, is that correct?
We do. Jason Padden, Counselor Padden's, yeah. So deja vu, which is great. No, I'm pleased that he was assigned. And he's very familiar with this process.
Hey, Don. So we have just for clarification, we canceled the October 9th meeting.
Yes.
We do have one on the 23rd?
Yes, we do.
And then when is the following one after that?
November 13th.
Okay, thank you.
And then November 27, and I'm pretty sure we're going to have something on December 11th. That's the last meeting of the year. The one falls on Christmas Day after that, and I know no one will be here on Christmas Day.
No, sir.
There will be no video.
No.
Is that a holiday? Okay. Yeah, I didn't think it was, yeah.
I would say that summit was really cool. It was nice to see people from the community there, and it was fun to hear sidebar discussions at all the other work groups, because there's a whole lot of ideas of what should be versus what is, and it was fascinating to hear what people knew or thought they knew, and then what they walked away from after that visit. I think it was very eye-opening for at least the table next to us.
Yep.
It was definitely interesting to hear their thoughts on everything that was covered.
I enjoyed the commonalities, even though every group had different thoughts. There are many themes that were common, and I also really appreciated the commentary about the fabric, the social fabric of this community, and the importance of that fabric, which is quite broad. Yeah.
Would it be possible for us to get a follow-up email listing the events and some of the publicly open things like the project advisory boards and
Yeah,
whatnot?
absolutely.
Just to
Yep, I'll send that out
track
to you.
that a little bit better. Thank you.
And that was it. That's what I've got. So we'll have a break. So hopefully Commissioner Ewert will read his email, so he will not show up on the 9th. So he'll be here by himself.
I'll reach out to him and make sure. Although that would be funny.
Missed the last 3 meetings.
I think we should
Okay.
tell him that we passed unanimously a thing about, this whole zoning thing regarding the lot sizes and developing.
Banning motorcycle parking.
Yeah, we banned all motorcycle parking. Oh, that'll get Patton too, man. I'll tell you what, he'll get fired up. Okay, so unless anybody else has anything,
Was there anything on slide 14?
Go ahead, Lainey. I think it's just a thank you.
Psych.
Fini.
Yeah. Dun, 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 dun.
Yeah.
Nothing for me then.
Okay. So do we have a motion to wrap up for the evening?
I move we close.
I'll second that.
Second, very well. We will adjourn for the evening. Thank you very much, Canby.